Welcome to the Utica Phoenix Deep Dive podcast. Today we're going to be looking at a case that could completely change how we think about climate change and corporate accountability.
Yeah.
It's the city of Honolulu versus some of the biggest names in the oil industry.
Oh, wow.
And the Supreme Court just made a ruling that is sending shockwaves through the legal world.
I bet.
So to help us unpack all of this, we've got a stack of articles here.
Okay.
From Bloomberg, CBS News, NBC News, Newsweek, and Reuters, plus a legal analysis from the blog Reason.
Wow, that's a lot.
So clearly this case has caught the attention of everybody.
Yeah.
From legal scholars to environmental activists.
Mm.
So what is at the heart of Honolulu's argument here?
Honolulu is essentially claiming that major oil companies deceive the public about the risks of fossil fuels, and this violates state consumer protection laws.
Interesting.
So they're not focusing on the company's emissions themselves,
Okay.
but rather on their words and their marketing campaigns.
So instead of saying you polluted, you pay, they're saying you lied, and now we're suffering the consequences.
Exactly.
That's a really interesting angle.
Yeah, and it's potentially a very powerful one.
I see.
Honolulu is arguing that these oil companies knew about the risks of climate change, but actively downplayed or misled the public about them, and that this deception led to specific, measurable harm in Honolulu.
Okay, so what kind of harm are we talking about?
Things like rising sea levels, which threaten coastal properties and infrastructure, a stressed power grid struggling to cope with the increased demand for cooling as temperatures rise, and the massive cost of upgrading infrastructure to withstand the impacts of climate change.
So they're saying, look, we're facing these very real, very expensive problems because we were misled by these companies about the risks of climate change.
Exactly.
Okay, but how does the Supreme Court factor into all of this?
Well, the oil companies tried to get the case dismissed, arguing that it should be handled at the federal level, not by individual cities. They appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, but the court refused to hear the appeal.
So that's a pretty big deal, right?
Yeah.
What does that mean for the lawsuit going forward?
It's a significant victory for Honolulu by refusing to hear the appeal. The Supreme Court effectively allows the lawsuit to continue in Hawaii state court.
Okay.
This doesn't mean Honolulu automatically wins,
Right.
but it clears a major hurdle.
Okay, so the Supreme Court has opened the door for this case to proceed.
Yes.
But the oil companies are making some pretty strong counter-arguments, right?
Yeah.
They're claiming this is a national or even international issue, not something a single city can sue over.
Right. Their central argument revolves around the concept of federal preemption, which basically means that in certain areas, federal law overrides state law.
Okay.
The oil companies are arguing that climate change is such an area. They're saying that Congress has already given the EPA the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, and that allowing individual cities to sue over climate change would create a confusing patchwork of regulations that could undermine federal efforts.
That's a valid point.
Yeah.
But doesn't Honolulu have a counter to that?
They do. They argue that their lawsuit isn't directly challenging federal regulations on emissions.
Okay.
It's about consumer protection, a domain traditionally governed by state law.
I see.
Their claim centers on the idea that the oil companies engaged in deceptive marketing practices, which violates Hawaii's consumer protection laws.
So it's a really subtle legal distinction. They're saying we're not suing over the pollution itself, but over the lies that led to the pollution.
Yeah, right.
Clever strategy.
Indeed, and it's a strategy that seems to have persuaded the Supreme Court, at least for now. Their decision to let the case proceed suggests that they see a difference between federal common law claims and state-level consumer protection claims when it comes to climate change litigation.
So this is about more than just Honolulu versus big oil. This could set a legal precedent that opens the floodgates for similar lawsuits across the country.
Exactly.
What are the stakes here? What could this mean for the oil industry if Honolulu wins?
The financial implications are potentially enormous.
Okay.
We could be talking billions, even trillions of dollars in liability if other cities and states follow Honolulu's lead. That's why the oil companies are fighting so hard to get this case dismissed. And it's not just about the money. A victory for Honolulu could fundamentally shift the legal landscape when it comes to corporate accountability for climate change.
Right.
Yeah, it could embolden other cities and states to pursue similar litigation, potentially leading to a wave of lawsuits against fossil fuel companies and other industries deemed to have contributed to climate change.
So we've got this high-stakes legal battle playing out, but let's delve a bit deeper into the legal arguments themselves.
Okay.
What exactly will Honolulu need to prove in court to win this case?
Well, they'll need to present a very strong case backed up by compelling evidence. First and foremost, they'll have to demonstrate that these oil companies did indeed engage in deceptive marketing practices.
I see.
This means proving that the companies knew about the risks of climate change, but deliberately downplayed or misrepresented those risks to the public. Think internal documents, marketing materials, maybe even testimony from former executives who can shed light on what the companies knew and when they knew it.
That sounds like a pretty daunting task.
Yeah.
How can they possibly prove what these companies knew and when they knew it, especially if they were trying to keep it under wraps?
It will certainly be challenging, but it's not impossible.
Okay.
There's a growing body of research and investigative journalism that has uncovered evidence suggesting that some oil companies were aware of the potential dangers of climate change as far back as the 1970s.
Wow.
Honolulu's legal team will likely draw on this existing research, as well as attempt to subpoena internal company documents and communications that could reveal what these companies knew about climate change and when they knew it.
So it's like a legal detective story unfolding. They're piecing together a timeline, trying to connect the dots between what the companies knew and what they told the public. But even if they can prove that these companies knew about climate change and downplayed the risks, how do they connect that to the specific harm Honolulu is experiencing?
That's the second key element of their case, establishing a clear link between the oil company's alleged deception and the specific harm Honolulu is claiming.
Okay.
They need to show that the city's rising sea levels, the strain on its power grid, the costs of upgrading infrastructure, that all of these problems are directly attributable to the oil company's actions and their failure to warn the public about the risks of fossil fuels.
That sounds incredibly difficult to prove. Climate change is such a complex issue with so many contributing factors.
Yeah.
How can they possibly isolate the specific harm caused by these oil companies?
It's a complex undertaking, but not insurmountable. They'll likely rely on expert testimony from climate scientists, economists, and engineers to demonstrate that the burning of fossil fuels produced by these companies directly contributed to the rising global temperatures that are driving sea level rise and other climate impacts. They'll need to draw a clear line from the oil company's actions to the specific harms Honolulu is experiencing.
So they need to convince the jury that these oil companies are not just contributing to a global problem,
You're right.
but that their actions are directly responsible for the specific harms Honolulu is facing. And the oil companies will undoubtedly have their own experts trying to poke holes in that argument.
Absolutely. The oil companies will likely argue that climate change is a complex issue with many contributing factors, and that it's impossible to isolate the specific harm caused by their actions alone.
Okay.
They may point to other sources of greenhouse gas emissions, such as deforestation or agricultural practices.
Right.
And they'll likely emphasize that individuals and governments also play a role in climate change.
So it's going to be a battle of the experts with both sides, presenting complex scientific evidence and economic models to support their arguments. This is definitely not going to be an open and shut case.
It's going to be a fascinating legal battle to watch unfold, with each side trying to convince the juror that their interpretation of the scientific evidence and the law is the correct one, and the outcome of this case could have far-reaching implications.
Yeah.
Not just for the oil industry, but for the future of climate change litigation.
This is definitely a case that demands a deep dive.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to do in the final part of this episode.
Okay.
We'll step back from the specifics of the Honolulu case and explore some of the broader implications of this type of litigation and what it could mean for the future of corporate responsibility in a world facing the increasingly urgent challenges of climate change. So we've got this legal drama unfolding in Hawaii, but the ripples of this case could spread far beyond the courtroom. It raises a bigger question: what does corporate responsibility actually look like in the age of climate change?
It's it's not enough to just follow environmental laws anymore.
Right.
This case pushes us to think about whether companies have a deeper obligation to be truthful about their impact on the planet and on people.
And that's where the whole issue of greenwashing comes in. We see companies spending tons of money to present themselves as eco-conscious, even if their core business is, well, not so eco-friendly.
Exactly. For years, many oil companies have run those slick ad campaigns with wind turbines and pristine landscapes,
Right.
trying to project an image of environmental responsibility.
Yeah.
But Honolulu is arguing that this kind of marketing is actually part of the harm they've suffered. They were led to believe that these companies were taking climate change seriously when, according to their lawsuit, the reality was quite different.
So it's like a breach of trust. If companies aren't honest about their environmental impact, how can consumers make informed decisions?
Precisely, and that's why this case has implications far beyond the energy sector.
Right.
It forces us to reconsider what true corporate responsibility means. Across all industries, can companies just talk a good game about sustainability?
Right.
Or do they need to back it up with real action?
Okay, but let's be practical. Does this mean every consumer now needs to become a climate expert, scrutinizing every corporate sustainability report?
Well, I don't think it requires everyone to become a scientist.
Right.
But it does highlight the importance of being an informed consumer.
Okay.
We need to ask questions, demand transparency, and support companies that are genuinely committed to addressing their climate impact, not just talking about it.
So it's about using our purchasing power, doing our research, and maybe even putting pressure on companies to do better.
Exactly. And this lawsuit gives people a new tool to hold corporations accountable. It's saying you don't have to accept greenwashing at face value if a company is making misleading claims. You can challenge them.
So it's not just about one city versus big oil anymore.
Right.
It's about a potential shift in power, where consumers and communities have more leverage to demand action on climate change.
And it's happening at a critical time. The urgency of the climate crisis demands that we rethink our relationship with corporations and what we expect from them.
Yeah.
This case is a powerful reminder that we're not powerless.
Right.
We have choices, and those choices can make a difference.
This deep dive has taken us from a courtroom in Hawaii to the heart of the climate crisis and the question of corporate responsibility.
Yeah.
It's a complex story, but ultimately a hopeful one. It shows that people are finding new ways to demand accountability and fight for a more sustainable future.
And it reminds us that change is possible. It might start with a lawsuit, but it ultimately depends on all of us citizens, consumers, investors, and yes, even corporations working together to create a future where economic prosperity and environmental sustainability go hand in hand.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It was fun.
It's a topic that deserves ongoing attention, so we encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions, and stay engaged.
And if you want to explore more fascinating topics like this one, be sure to subscribe to the Utica Phoenix YouTube channel. We're digging deep into the issues that matter, and we'd love to have you along for the journey.